So if you couldn't tell by the title of this video, I'm going to be doing something different today, right? Instead of the usual, Trump impersonations or what have you, I'm going to be doing something a little different. So if you clicked on the video and you read the title, you would be thinking one of a few things. Either A, really Tyler? Why are you doing this? B, Tyler, you're stupid, you can't do this. C, what? So I understand that you have come with all these questions, and I am prepared to answer them. So today, we will be dividing by 0. So our first step will be to show that 1 divided by 0 equals 1 divided by 0. This is pretty simple, right? You can say that something equals something if you mean the same thing when you say, rather, something both times. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I say 1 divided by 0 both of these times, they mean the same thing, right? Whether or not this has a solution, it's still the same thing as this thing. They're this exact same thing. So, 1 divided by 0 equals 1 divided by 0. Part 1 is done. Yay. See, that wasn't too much bad. That wasn't too much math. I don't think so. It's pretty good. Now we're going to move on to part 2. Part 2. We want to show that 1 divided by 0 equals something. So to do this, what we'll do is we'll say 0 equals 0. This is obvious, right? So by that sentiment, 0 times 1 equals 0. And 2 times 0 equals 0, right? So we could say that 1 times 0 equals 2 times 0. Now what we're going to do from here is we're going to multiply both sides by 1 divided by 0. Right, so we get 1 divided by 0 times 1 times 0 equals 1 divided by 0 times 2 times 0. Okay, pretty simple, right? And then what we're going to do from there, all we're going to do is rearrange these. So we get 1 divided by 0 times 1 equals 1 divided by 0 times 2. What we can do here with the 1 divided by 0 times 0, well, that's the same thing as 1 times 0 divided by 0, which is the same thing as 0 divided by 0. So if we combine these two statements, we get 0 divided by 0 times 1 equals 0 divided by 0 times 2, right? So this is another way of saying, well, this is just 0 divided by 0, right? 0 divided by 0 equals 2 times 0 divided by 0. Okay? So we're going to subtract 0 divided by 0 from both sides. So 0 divided by 0 minus 0 divided by 0 equals 2 times 0 divided by 0 minus 0 divided by 0. Okay? These two will cancel each other out to get 0, because if you have the same thing, you subtract them from each other, always gives you 0, no matter what. So 0 equals, now this is more complicated. What we're going to do here, we're going to use the distributive property to pull out 0 divided by 0. So 0 divided by 0 times 2, and then this is 1 times 0 divided by 0, so minus 1, right? 0 equals 0 divided by 0 times 2 minus 1. 2 minus 1 is just 1, so 0 divided by 0 equals 1. We haven't shown yet that 1 divided by 0 equals something, but we have shown that 0 divided by 0 equals 0, and this will help us to show that 1 divided by 0 equals something, okay? Part 3. In this part, we'll show that 1 divided by 0 is the same thing as any number, we'll say n, divided by 0, okay? So any number divided by 0 is the same thing as 1 divided by 0. How we're going to do this is we're going to say any number divided by 0, right, equals to any number times 1 divided by 0. Okay, that's pretty simple. We just put out the n in front of it. And then from there, this is the same thing as saying 1 divided by 1 over n times 1 over 0. I'll show you an example of this, right? 2 equals 1 divided by 1/2. 3 equals 1 divided by 1/3. So any number is equal to 1 divided by 1 over itself. Okay? So what we can do from here is we can say 1 over 1 over any number times 0, right? Of course, any number can't be 0 because then we'd be dividing by 0, okay? So what we're going to do from there is we say, okay, 1 over any number, that's just any number, times 0, that's just 0, so 1 over 0. So what we have now is any number over 0 equals 1 over 0. Great. This will help us to determine what anything divided by 0 is, okay? Okay, so now we're going to go to our final part. See, that wasn't too hard, was it? This is part 4. It's great. So, part 4 works like this. We already determined that any number over 0 equals 1 over 0, right? So, because this is true, right, that means that any number times 1 over 0, of course, when any number is not 0, so we'll just say that any number is not equal to 0. So it can be anything except for 0. And we're going to have to make it any number except for 1. You'll see why in a second. Equals 1 divided by 0. Okay, any number times 1 divided by 0 equals 1 divided by 0. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do what we did in part 2, and we're going to subtract 1 divided by 0 from both sides. Any number times 1 divided by 0 minus 1 divided by 0 equals 1 divided by 0 minus 1 divided by 0. Okay, so this part, again, we're going to use the distributive property. So we're going to pull out 1 divided by 0 times any number minus 1 equals 0. Now this is why it's important that any number is not equal to 1. Because if any number equals 1, then you'll see in the next step that we would be dividing by 0. We can't use division by 0 to prove division by 0, right? It's circular reasoning. So we're going to divide both sides by any number minus 1, which is the same thing as multiplying 1 over any number minus 1. And that's equal to 0 times 1 over any number minus 1. Okay, these two things cancel each other out, right? They're the exacts, they're reciprocals, so they're just multiplied together to equal 1. So that means 1 divided by 0 equals, well, what we got over here? This should just be a number, right? Just be any number right here. So what we got here is 0. 1 divided by 0 equals 0. Now we can move on to our conclusion. Conclusion. So, we've already determined that any number divided by 0 equals 1 divided by 0. 1 divided by 0 equals 0. And 0 equals 0 divided by 0. This part was step 3. This part was step 4. And this part was step 2. Okay. We also determined that any number can't be 1 and any number can't be 0. But it doesn't matter because 1 divided by 0 equals 0 and 0 divided by 0 equals 0. So what we can say from that is any number divided by 0 equals 0, definitively. Doesn't matter what your number is. Any number, when you divide it by 0, equals 0. No problems here. Now we're going to go into some counter arguments, which people will use to say that I'm wrong. Okay? Because obviously there are people who are going to do that. So, counter argument number 1 is we have people who will say, okay, well when you do multiplication, you're doing A times B equals C. These can be any numbers, right? A, B, and C, just any numbers. Well, that's the same thing as saying A equals C divided by B. Okay, this is fine. And what they will say is if you have 1 divided by 0 and you're saying, okay, that equals 0. Equals 0, okay. Well, that means that you can say A times B equals C. C is 1, B is 0, and A is 0. So that means that if 1 divided by 0 equals 0, 0 times 0 equals 1. Now the reason why this is wrong is because in order to get from here to here, you had to do something very important. So if I have A equals C divided by B, I would have to multiply both sides by b to get that, because b and b cancel out, and you get a times b equals c, okay? But the problem with that in this particular instance is saying 0 equals 1 divided by 0, right? Okay, let's just assume that to be true, which we've already proven it, so we don't really have to assume it, but let's just say it's true. We will multiply both sides by 0. We'll do that down here, save space, equals 1 divided by 0 times 0. Now, the logic up here would have you cancel this out, but you can't do that, because that assumes that 0 divided by 0 equals 1. Assume, which is very bad. You can't assume anything in math. So 0 divided by 0 does not equal 1. In fact, we just showed that over here. 0 divided by 0 equals 0. So you can't do this. When you would multiply both sides by 0, you just get 0 equals 0, not this up here, which says 0 equals 1. This is wrong, of course. Obviously, 0 times 0 is not equal to 1. Counter argument number 2 would be saying, okay, my first step is wrong. Because 1 divided by 0 cannot equal anything. Now, the reason why this logic is wrong has a very serious fallacy. It assumes that 1 divided by 0 cannot equal anything. And that's a perfectly fine and dandy assumption, right? Just like the assumption that the square root of negative 1 can't equal anything. Or, for that matter, 1 minus 2 can't equal anything. Or, for that matter, 5 divided by 4 can't equal anything. Because at one time, these all didn't equal anything. So they just don't equal anything. You can't have that, of course. 1 divided by 0 can equal something. Now, not using exemplary examples, look at that. Not using examples like these, I'm going to show why this is wrong. So, 1 divided by 0 is a concept. It doesn't necessarily need to be defined. Like, space is a concept. It doesn't need to be defined. If you use it in the right context, it's not mathematically defined, sure. But everybody understands what you're saying. Like if I say outer space, that's not mathematically defined. It's not necessarily mathematically defined as a number. It's not a value. But outer space still equals outer space. Right? Just because something isn't defined, it doesn't mean it can't equal itself. So obviously, by that concept, 1 divided by 0 equals 1 divided by 0. You can say that 1 divided by 0 does not equal 1 divided by 0. But then something must be up, right? Because then a divided by b does not equal a divided by b. Which obviously these two things equal each other. So if you say 1 divided by 0 cannot equal 1 divided by 0, then all your math is broken. So 1 divided by 0 needs to equal itself for math to work. Right? And the third thing that people will say is wrong with my argument is really two things put together. They'll say 0 divided by 0 minus 0 divided by 0 does not necessarily equals 0. This is a symbol that I completely made up. Does not necessarily. It's just an abbreviation. So, likewise, they'll say 1 minus 0, or 1 divided by 0 minus 1 divided by 0 is not necessarily equal to 0 as well. Well, the reason why this must be true is because if you have anything, a equals a, right? We'll use our outer space example again. So, outer space. We'll abbreviate that to OS just to save time. Okay? So, outer space equals outer space, right? So I can, well, I'll call negate. You're not really subtracting. Negate just means to opposite it, make it its opposite. So if I take outer space and I negate, which is basically the same thing as subtraction, outer space from it, well, obviously I get that outer space subtract outer space because negation and subtraction are the same thing. Negation is just a logical way of saying it. It's how you say subtraction in logic, that is. Equals, well, obviously outer space. When you take away outer space from it, you're left with nothing, which is 0. So outer space minus outer space equals 0. Likewise, we can say that because 1 divided by 0 equals 1 divided by 0, and same thing for 0 divided by 0, we can negate or subtract 1 divided by 0 from both sides, right? Well, that gives us 1 divided by 0 minus 1 divided by 0 equals, well, nothing, because these cancel each other out. 0. So in the end, what we have here is a foolproof without assumptions. That anything divided by 0 is 0. Or in mathematical terms, any number divided by 0 equals 0. So if you think that I'm wrong at all, please contact me. I'm open to suggestions, right? Because if you give me something that makes this wrong, then I can use that to make myself righter. Basically, if I can prove that wrong, it makes my claim better. If you have any questions at all, please contact me, right, in the comments below. Please leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, because that's great. It's real great. So, that's all, folks.